Welcome to all at service today. Let our chalice flame be lit, and may it ignite that understanding which goes beyond ordinary comprehension. Let what was shrouded in darkness become enlightened.
That's if I can. I don't know how to do this.
Is that?
Some matches.
I think we might need matches. All right.
So, right.
Thank
you.
I see, yes. Sorry to have given you such a hard task.
Okay. There we go.
Thank you. Technology defeats almost all of us. Today's service considers the concept of serenity, and in doing so, begs two questions, which I'll endeavor to explore as best I can. But don't expect clear answers, just more questions. The two that I want to highlight are, what is the relationship between serenity and the concept of a higher power? And the second one is our own Christian tradition redundant in all but the commandment to love our neighbor as ourselves? Let's sing our first hymn, which reminds us, as do the others, of our Christian roots. victorious, thy great name we praise. Unresting, unhasting, and silent as night, no wanting, no wasting, in night. Thy justice like mountains, thy soaring above, thy clouds which are fountains of goodness and love. To all life thou givest, to both great and small. In all life thou livest, the true life. We blossom and flourish as leaves on the tree, wither and perish, but what changeth thee? Great Spirit of glory, the source of light, thine angels adore thee, unveiling their sight. What we would render, O is of the splendor of light guideth thee. I could have chosen stories as the theme of this service, for who has not found serenity in stories? Stories we have read, stories we've been told, and stories we have ourselves invented to make sense of our lives. Under the category of stories, I include all artistic creations of any worth. But it's easiest to illustrate the point with examples from literature and film. When we read a novel or watch a play or film, we literally enter into a make-believe world. We come to know the characters, to feel what they feel, to face the dilemmas they face, to rejoice in their resolutions, or grieve over the inclemency of an unbending fate. Tragedy, in its literal sense, is a particular kind of story in which a dreaded sequence of events plays out inevitably. We may be tempted to cry out, "For heaven's sake, can't you see what you're doing?" Accidents are not, according to this definition, tragedies, though nowadays they are often described as such. Curiously, whether the outcome of a story is joyful or tragic, we experience through this detached make-believe that deeper understanding which leads to serenity. When we reach the end of the novel or come out of the cinema, reality is for a short while what we've just experienced, and the supposedly real world which crashes in on us may feel like a weird dream. For 1800 years, more or less, that particular collection of diverse and sometimes contradictory stories, called the Bible, was the medium through which most people experienced serenity. In all its paradox and diversity, it reflected life, but at the same time dramatized it. The solid presence of churches and cathedrals, the regularity of worship, the familiarity from childhood of scripture and ritual, the assurance of salvation, or at least of a future which was determined and unchangeable, and the central tragedy of Jesus' trial and crucifixion, provided countless generations of our fellow beings with, quotes, the peace of God which passeth all understanding. I don't propose to trace the manifold causes behind the transformation of Britain within half a century, say from 1830 to 1880, from a country in which religious faith was accepted and rarely challenged, to one where skepticism and atheism were becoming respectable. Let the pious William Wilberforce represent the earlier date, and the atheist Charles Bradlaugh the later one. What I do want to do is to draw your attention to the near-fatal double whammy dealt to conventional faith in opposite ways by Karl Marx and Charles Darwin. In a sense, Karl Marx hijacked Christianity by substituting faith in humanity and progress for faith in God. His philosophy had at its roots the commandment to love our neighbors as ourselves. It envisaged a beloved community of equals who would live their happy lives without the need for fairy tales. Those who clung to traditional religion were to be pitied for their addiction to a drug, the opium of the people, delivered by the ruling classes to protect their power. Marx had an unshakable belief in the goodness of all oppressed humans and in the power of reason and history to overcome all obstacles. Although only a small minority of people call themselves Marxists nowadays, in spirit, Marxism is alive and well, and not least among Unitarians. It is an optimistic outlook, a utopian one even. Just 11 years after the revolutions of 1848 and the publication of Marx's Communist Manifesto, Charles Darwin published his very different Origin of Species. Unlike Marx, and despite his Unitarian roots, Darwin was a meticulous scientist and consequently became a skeptic. His groundbreaking work trashed his Christianity by undermining the cherished idea that humans, animals, and plants, as we saw them, had always been so since they were created by God. Once the concept of natural selection had been demonstrated, it was obvious that this could also explain how humans came to exist. This wasn't in any way compatible with the supposed infallible account of the creation given in the first chapter of Genesis. Humankind was clearly not God's sixth day of work, as it was there recounted. Moreover, our arrival on this planet, like that of all our fellow organisms, was the product of an uncaring process in which death and destruction played a crucial part. And, unlike in Marx's view, reason played little part. It was a pessimistic outlook, and to its many opponents, a destructive one. Modern research on Darwin's letters and notes reveals his private thoughts long before the publication of The Origin of Species, and even longer before he spelled it all out in The Descent of Man in 1871. Our first reading consists of edited extracts from Charles Darwin's entry in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography. Between 1831 and 1836, Darwin participated in all the excitements of the Beagle voyage. I guess you all know about the Beagle voyage. He went to the Galapagos Islands, but very many other places as well. The Galapagos Islands are the ones which we remember. He joined the carnival in Brazil, witnessed revolutions in Montevideo and Lima, and saw gauchos exterminating the natives on the Pampas. He watched Mount Osorno erupting and walked through the ruins of the town of Concepcion, destroyed by an earthquake. He declared these natural disasters to be, quotes, the most awful yet interesting spectacle I have ever beheld. It was a humbling vision that revealed the powerlessness of people and the impermanence of their works before the awesome forces of nature. Meanwhile, well before the publication of Origins, as the Tory Anglicans were ousted from town halls in countrywide reforms following the Reform Act, Darwin was undermining their providential God with a reformed biology. Of Unitarian stock himself, he expressed radical dissenting sentiments in his notebooks, sentiments of equality, anti-slavery, and anti-privilege to sustain a leveling kinship with all life. He wrote, "Animals whom we have made our slaves, we do not like to consider our equals. Do not slaveholders behave in the same way? Animals are our fellow brethren in pain, disease, death, and suffering." Gloomy stuff. But Darwin knew that his speculations would alienate the Anglican establishment, which saw evolution as a threat. He concluded that their whole miraculous fabric would totter and fall, but not without a struggle. On one occasion, Darwin had a nightmare of being executed, and he began thinking of ways to defend himself. And he wrote in his notebook, "Mention persecution of early astronomers," to demonstrate that this kind of persecution was unfair and wrong. In 1838, Darwin filled 2 notebooks on the behavioral, psychological, and metaphysical implications of evolution for mankind. Evolution from the first was designed to explain human morality no less than our physical bodies. Darwin's first sight of an ape, an orangutan, in London Zoo led him to make notes on her human-like emotions. He accepted that morality was relative to the culture in which it was created and saw its origin in the social instincts of pack animals. Let's take a break with our second hymn, which is number 101, "Dear Lord and Father of Mankind." Our second reading is of a quite different character. It comes from Alexander McCall Smith's recently published novel, The Enigma of Garlic, the latest in his Scotland Street series. It deals with the question of religious belief in the modern world. Two Edinburgh friends, Angus and Matthew, talk about Scottish exceptionalism. This leads on to American exceptionalism and British exceptionalism. Angus draws attention to the God is an Englishman view of the world. And Matthew asks whether Scots believed in a Scottish God and the French in a French God. Here is how they continued.
I think we make God in our image, Angus said, even as we assert that he made us in his image. Matthew was looking at Angus intently. He was reflecting on the fact that there were certain questions we seldom ask our friends, and one of them was, do you believe in God? People found that question too embarrassing, too personal, perhaps, like asking somebody about a medical complaint. He had no idea whether Angus had any religious belief, and yet surely it was important to know that about a friend. It was such an important part of life, after all. So he asked him. Angus took a sip of wine. Yes and no, he said. I happen to believe there's some greater purpose, if you will, in life. I'm not always sure what that is, but I feel it, you know. And since I happen to have been born where I was born, at the time when I was born, then a particular spiritual means of expression is available to me. It's part of my story, so to speak. And so I participate in that willingly. I respect what it stands for, and I respect those who profess it. But inside, Matthew pressed. Inside should, as far as possible, be the same as outside, replied Angus.
Thank you, Christine. Angus's view that we make God in our image is more in accord with how Darwin saw matters. With our extensive knowledge about the beliefs of other peoples across the globe, it's difficult to avoid the conclusion that he's right. How otherwise can we account for the differences between them? If there's only one God, and if in one fell swoop he made all the peoples in his image, then surely they should all have the same beliefs. But they don't. Anthropology, the study of the human species in all its variety, has shattered any such idea. Does this make the words of the hymns we're singing today meaningless? Or are they at least a comfortable illusion, the assumption of a God up there who loves us and looks after us? Would we be better off without such childish stories? Juliet Samuel, though not a Christian, takes a different view. Writing recently in the Times, she tells us we should mourn the decline of Christianity. And I quote, "The bells still ring out on Sunday morning, just as they have done for hundreds of years at the church nearest my home. The church helps to structure the community I live in, building networks that I also inhabit between parents in the playground and nearby nurseries and school. It's faint, but it's still there. Across Britain, however, these sorts of networks are fading like old root structures, turning to mulch. A survey of Anglican clergy commissioned by the Times has found that almost 2/3 of them believe this is no longer a Christian country." So, what are we doing here today? Are we trying to deny progress? Are we too afraid to face up to a godless world? Samuel implies something a bit different. Christianity is a kind of glue which holds society and various communities together. She doesn't believe in all its doctrines, but she does believe in its value and is worried that we're losing it. Time for another hymn, the words of which were penned by the 14th century mystic poet Bianco da Siena. Sorry, I didn't tell you what it was, but you've got it up there. Hymn number 45, "Come Down, O Love Divine." Down, O love divine, seek thou this soul of mine, and visit it with thy unuttered glory. O Comforter, draw near, with turn to dust and ashes when its heat consumes, and let its glorious light shine in my sight, and clothe me round the world my perfume. Holy charity, mine outward vesture, lowliness become my inner clothing. True lowliness out, which takes the humbler part, and all its own shortcomings keeps below. Burning straw with which the soul long shall far outpass the power of human tale. For none can gaze its grace till we become the place when the Holy Spirit takes the dwelling. Let us now ponder on serenity, or if you prefer, call it peace of mind, tranquility, or you could consider it a little more negatively, resignation and stoicism. Get yourself in the most comfortable position you can, and we take a minute to empty our minds of everyday clutter, including what we have been discussing. Now find that space in your mind with a gate marked serenity. Pass through the gate and wonder at the beauty of the garden. You've never seen such brilliantly colored flowers. Bees buzz around them, sucking out the nectar. A bench invites you to sit down, and you accept. The sky is blue, and somewhere up there, skylarks are singing. A stream gurgles through the garden and disappears through a hole in the wall. You notice an exit nearby and are drawn to pass through it. You're now in a meadow where sheep are peacefully grazing. You lie down on the grass and fall asleep. I hope you had a good sleep. The psychologist Carl Jung characterized the lifespan of the individual by a metaphor of the sun sweeping across the sky. Of childhood, he wrote, "In the morning it rises from the nocturnal sea of unconsciousness and looks upon the wide, bright world which lies before it in an expanse that steadily widens the higher it climbs in the firmament." End of quote. Full separation from the parents generally happened in puberty with the, quotes, eruption of sexuality. The period after puberty, which he called youth, stretched to the mid to late 30s and was when the individual found his or her place in the world. The sun, at its highest point, represented midlife and a change of attitudes, sometimes accompanied by a crisis. Typically, family became more important at this time and position in the world relatively less so. The sinking sun represented old age, a time of assessing one's life and seeing the bigger picture. The evolutionary advantage of this stage was that the wisdom garnered was conveyed to younger generations. Lastly, sunset represented approaching death, on which Jung laid considerable emphasis, for he saw our knowledge of its inevitability as structuring our lives. Now, where does serenity fit into this description? Some might say that it's the compensation of old age, when the embers glow dimly, the passions are tempered, and the fear of missing out on life's offerings has all but passed. But could it be that serenity is an offering which we both need and crave, whatever our age? The Welsh poet William Henry Davies, author of the autobiography of a supertramp, seems to have thought so. What is this life, if full of care? We have no time to stand and stare. No time to stand beneath the boughs and stare as long as sheep or cows. No time to see when woods we pass. Turn 2 pages. Start again. No time to see when woods we pass, where squirrels hide their nuts in grass. No time to see in broad daylight streams full of stars like skies at night. No time to turn at beauty's glance and watch her feet, how they can dance. No time to wait till her mouth can enrich that smile her eyes began. A poor life this, if full of care. We have no time to stand and stare. When I started to lead Unitarian services in this church more than 10 years ago, I was skeptical about the use of religious language and avoided it if I possibly could. For reflective texts, I wrote lists of sentences beginning with "let us," ... But I became increasingly uncomfortable with this approach. It was too us-centered. In order to achieve the kind of detachment which Buddhists recognize rather better than the inhabitants of the modern Western world, we needed to get outside of ourselves, to see ourselves and our dealings in the world as if from a distance. I came to see that belief in God had a useful purpose, even if your belief was more like the suspension of disbelief which we experience when reading a novel, or the abandonment of reasoned understanding when listening to music. In other words, we needed stories in which we could believe. Sometimes the most powerful of these were hallowed ancient narratives, buried deep in our culture and carried in our collective unconscious. Traditionally, Unitarians have prided themselves on being a rational denomination. But as the 19th century progressed, there was an increasing recognition that reason had its limits. You could say that we discovered that one of the functions of reason was to discover its own limits. The development of psychology, and particularly the contribution of Sigmund Freud, we learned that reason was just as likely to be used to obscure the truth as to discover it. Hence the need for a higher sphere in which we could see the wood and not just the trees. But why do we need serenity? It is a part of the misfortune of being human that we can foresee all the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. No other animal does this. Uniquely, we are troubled, terrified even, by what might happen, whereas other animals are terrified only when something bad is happening. We need a way of calming ourselves, for worry can threaten to drive us into a state of mental and physical collapse. There is, however, another important reason we need serenity. Without the detachment it brings, we may find it difficult to feel compassion for our fellow beings. In the Torah, God says to Moses, "If anyone injures his neighbor, as he has done, it shall be done to him. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth." Referring to this injunction, Jesus countered with the revolutionary idea that we should, on the contrary, love our enemies. How bad we've become at this nowadays. We love to hate our enemies. We've created laws against hate crime, which can be used to punish those simply expressing an opinion. And yet we seem addicted to finding what we consider legitimate targets for our hate. Top of the list are the international bogeymen, both alive and dead. But we also hate politicians of a different political persuasion to ours. We curse bankers and capitalists. We ridicule those with religious faith. And I'm afraid we Unitarians are not without guilt in this respect. We rail against trades unionists. We blame the male sex for all manner of evils. And we blame feminists for their supposed hatred of men. And we direct our ire against anyone who expresses an idea which is currently out of fashion. Hate figures appear to have become our safety valve in a world without religion. Serenity recalls us to a more balanced view. There is a moving moment later in the same McCall Smith novel we heard a reading from earlier. Nicola, not this Nicola, Nicola, mother of Stuart and mother-in-law of Irene, has taken on the care of young Bertie and Ulysses. She replaced Irene in this role following the latter's decamping to Aberdeen, officially to be supervised by Bertie's erstwhile psychiatrist, who is now a professor, but unofficially to cohabit with him. Irene's sudden return to Edinburgh for a 3-month stay in the marital home provokes a heated confrontation with Nicola, who hates her with a passion. Barely able to control herself, Nicola tells Irene more than a few home truths. But when Irene's defenses suddenly collapse, Nicola is disarmed. Here's how the story continues. Nicola reminded herself that for all her faults, and who amongst us is without fault, Irene still had all the hopes and fears which go with being human. As you did to the least of my brethren. The words came back to her from somewhere, from her school years in the borders perhaps, from that lumber room of the mind that we forget about, but in which so much of our deep self is located. As you did to the least of my brethren, you did it to me. She sat down at the table opposite Irene. She reached out and took the other woman's hand. That line from St. Matthew's Gospel, which says we should be kind to our fellow beings, was all it took. Such acts of forgiveness, which are difficult to achieve without entering a higher level of consciousness, are transformative. When Jesus was asked, which was the first commandment, he chose, also from the Torah, loving God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. He then added the second commandment, which was loving your neighbor as yourself. We've now reversed the order and virtually abandoned the love of God. This may be a mistake. Perhaps we can't love our fellow beings as much as we might wish without establishing a relationship with a higher being, whether that being actually exists or lives in our imagination. It seems to me no accident that Alcoholics Anonymous, the most successful of all anti-alcohol addiction organizations, has as the second of their 12-step program this sentence: we came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. 5 of the other steps refer to God. So half of all of the steps. You could say that alcoholics suffer from an inability to love themselves. That is, they hate themselves. People in such a condition have no faith in their own ability to think their way out. Belief in a higher being, even if this is really an outer ego, a second self, seems essential when dealing with the misdirection of the natural instinct to hate, whether of self or others. It is not that we should never hate. Quote, there is a time to love and a time to hate. The question is, when is it appropriate in any particular situation? Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter, says the preacher, Ecclesiastes. Fear God and keep his. Our conclusion might be rather different, but not perhaps entirely so. There is no going back to the faith of our ancestors. Darwin and Freud, among others, have let the genie out of the bottle. But if we strive to understand our own human condition with its mixture of animal nature and the capacity to reflect, much of what was obscure in religious scripture, of whatever faith, may appear in a new light. Take, for example, the crucifixion we hear so little about these days. The theology of redemption is, for good reason, unacceptable to Unitarians. But is there a danger that we've thrown out the baby with the bathwater? Doesn't that central Christian story tell us something about the vulnerability of us all. Isn't describing it as morbid another way of saying we don't like being reminded that we're mortal and that life is uncertain? Before we abandon any pretense of being a church with Christian roots, should we not recognize that Christianity is still deeply embedded in our culture? And, as Angus says, that it provides a particular spiritual means of expression and is a part of our story. If so, we would need to do more than pay lip service to our origins, albeit in no way dismissing the discoveries of the last 2 centuries. Believing that we can easily pick and mix from the different belief systems of the world may be an illusion. These other clothes may not so easily fit. And now we come to our last hymn, which is a beautiful setting of the verses by the 17th century poet George Herbert. Hymn number 72, My God and King. Church with songs must shout, no door can keep them out, but above the heart must bear the longest part. Let all the world in every corner sing, my God and King. T.S. Eliot wrote, I do not believe that the culture of Europe could survive the complete disappearance of the Christian faith. If Christianity goes, the whole of our culture goes. Then you must start painfully again, and you cannot put on a new culture ready-made. You must wait for the grass to grow, to feed the sheep, to give the wool, out of which your new coat will be made. You must pass through many centuries of barbarism. And lastly, the serenity prayer, which has helped many. God grant us the serenity to accept the things we cannot change, courage to change the things we can, and wisdom to know the difference.